stop jerking it so much, all right? The typical jerk pause retrieves with jerkbaits will actually catch you a lot less fish. So if you're struggling to catch fish, despite following all the traditional jerkbait advice out there, you'll want to try out this new technique. So in this video, I'll show you why the usual jerkbait retrieves prevent you from catching fish, the alternative retrieves that have helped hundreds of my clients get more bites, and the underwater footage of why this will work for you. Now first, let me show you why the typical jerkbait advice is costing you fish, and that is because many times you're dealing with finicky or inactive fish, and that very erratic motion from those hard jerks can really put the fish off instead of triggering bites. So instead of snapping your jerkbait, you just need to learn how to put a very subtle, very natural action to a bait or lure just like this that triggers a lot of finicky bites. Your jerkbait basically stays right in that strike zone and it just shimmies back and forth like a very natural suspended bait fish, and it will just catch you so many fish. I'm going to show you exactly how to do it right here. And I call this the quiver retrieve. Now there are two ways to accomplish the quiver technique, and the first one is going to be your slack line quiver. This is where you put slack in your line and you keep your rod tip low towards the water. This way wind doesn't grab your line and affect this retrieve. And then basically what you're going to do is you're just going to shake your rod. Okay, you're going to shake your rod just like this, and that bait vibrates but barely moves forward in the water. This is perfect for triggering those inactive bites because that suspended jerkbait is just sitting there but just shaking, just that little bit that looks so natural for a suspended bait fish. Now it's important to note, for this presentation to work, you're actually not going to reel in at all. You're just going to use that slack in your line and your rod tip to shake that line to get the action in a lure just like this. And the second technique is going to be the semi-tight quiver technique. This is still going to be a subtle lure retrieve, but it's going to move your lure forward in the water column. So basically you're going to keep a semi-tight line and you're going to do the same exact shaking motion with your rod, but with that line a little bit tighter, your bait or your jerk bait is going to creep forward in the water column a little bit. This is going to be much better for covering a little bit more water for a little bit more aggressive fish, because your bait is going to move forward horizontally a little bit quicker than the previous technique. Now it's important to note, for this presentation to work, you are barely reeling in your line as you're shaking your rod tip. You just want to maintain the same level of slack in your line to keep that bait still shimmering very subtly in the water column, but still moving forward to cover water and trigger bites from a little bit more aggressive fish. Now these two techniques are a pretty subtle presentation. What you'll find is when you go jerk pause, and that aggressive snap can actually put a lot of motion in that jerk bait and scare a lot of fish off when they're just not that active. But those little vibrations will really get the fish's attention without spooking them, hence triggering some more bites. So when should you use this technique over the typical jerk pause? Well, honestly, most of the year, but it's best anytime where you know where the fish are and you're just not getting bites. So basically you're dealing with inactive fish. It's phenomenal for later in the winter and early spring when the water temperatures are still very cold but starting to warm up, as well as the late fall and early winter where the water temperatures are cooling. But here's the most overlooked aspect of where a retrieve like this is really effective, and that is the dead of summer, the dog day heat of the summer, where the fish are overpressurized from all that fishing pressure they're receiving, and they're super hot and super lethargic. That is when a retrieve like this could really come in handy, and it's super overlooked because this is typically referred to as a cold water technique. Now these unique jerkbait techniques will absolutely catch you a ton of fish, but always remember the key to any fishing trip is finding the fish first. So always remember to pull up your charts, check out water depths and structures near your spots, and do some pre-trip planning. Now I actually built a free tool called the Fish a Lot Bot that does this entire process for you to make sure that you're on some fish. I'll link it in the description below. Be sure to check it out, Fish-a-Lots. So now you may ask, well, what type of water quality are you fishing in when you fish with a technique like that? And to be honest with you, it works really well in murky water because that constant subtle motion of the lure under the water really attracts fish in. Again, it's not super vibrating in there where I might put finicky fish off, but it's really subtle and it's constantly pulsating the location of that lure where a fish could track it down and eventually smack it. Now you might say, well, what about clear water? In clear water, it also works phenomenally well because again, that subtle motion of your bait, your suspended bait, looks perfectly like a natural bait fish. So in murky and clear water, this type of technique is phenomenal. I highly recommend it. Now let's look at this side by side underwater so you can see this exactly for yourselves. So first you see the standard jerk pause. Notice how fast and erratic the lure is. Now this is great when you're fishing for aggressive fish, but it could really turn off inactive fish and actually spook them. Now second, you see the slackline quiver. This is where the bait is barely moving forward, but is shimmying very subtly in place and stays perfectly in that strike zone. And the third here is going to be your semi-tight quiver. The same subtle shaking, but it's creeping forward in the water there so you could cover more water and find those fish a lot easier with a technique that's going to trigger bites. Now to get this retrieve and presentation just right, gear absolutely matters because the whole point is subtle vibration without moving the jerkbait out of the strike zone or too erratically where you're spooking fish. So can you do it on a bait caster? Well, sure. But if you really want the easiest setup for the quiver retrieve, use spinning gear. It's far easier to throw very light lures. You're not going to have to deal with backlashes, and it can be easier to manage your line as you're twitching and reeling or just twitching without reeling. Now for your rods, you really want a medium to medium light power rod right here. That means you don't have to give a whole lot of power to get the rod to bend. And of course, you're going to want moderate action. That is, the rod is going to bend down to the middle of the rod right here. So that is where the rod bends, is the action. And you want moderate action here because you want shock absorption when you're both working the lure and when you're setting the hook on a fish. Keep in mind, if you're using extra fast action, the slightest little movement on your rod is going to send the lure flying because there's no bend in the rod. It's like fishing with a broomstick. So any little tap or shake is really going to move the lure quite erratically, and the whole goal of this is subtle and slow to trigger finicky bites. So for your line, I would go lighter for your line for the more subtle action. I would recommend 6 to 10 pound line depending where you're fishing. If you're fishing in open water, you get away with 6 pound test line easy. That's what I would recommend. If you're fishing in more heavy cover, like a lot of wood, grass, rocks, something like this, you go 8 to 10. Now your rod positioning is going to be key. You want to keep your rod low to the water to avoid that wind getting your line and you losing contact with your lure. And also you want to keep your rod at an angle to the wind. Okay, so you want to be fishing this kind of sideways. Your lure would be out here, your rod would be over here, and you're twitching it ever so slightly. This way you're maintaining contact with the lure at all times. And then when a fish does bite, you just simply pull back in the opposite direction of the fish. And keep in mind, we're using trebles here. So you don't want to do the ridiculous Bassmaster Classic type of hook set that you see all the time on social media. Just pull back on the rod when you feel the weight of the fish. Don't swing at it. That whole cross his eyes type of hook set. You want to avoid that at all costs. The hard hook set, especially with a stiff or fast action rod, will absolutely rip those hooks right out of the fish's mouths. And if you're using extra fast action rods and heavy power rods, that fish is going to be able to throw the trebles when you're fighting it. When it shakes its head, it's just under constant pressure. There's no shock absorption, and the fish will throw the hooks, throw the lure. You're not going to catch nearly as many fish. Now, this very rarely subtle retrieve for jerkbaits can absolutely catch you a ton more fish. Now, if you want even more advice on overlooked fishing tactics out there that just catch huge fish, go ahead and click on this video right here, where I reveal one of the most understated ways to catch largemouth bass that could really separate you from everybody else out there on the water. Thanks for tuning in, Fish Lots. I'll see you out there on the water.